That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Hello, and welcome to episode 59 of Only Human. Today I want to take just a minute to talk about something that occurred to me this week and how difficult and challenging it can be to operate in this completely politically polarized environment we find ourselves in right now. And maybe learn a few lessons that we can all use to navigate these challenges a little more effectively. So, like always, I want to start with a Blue Threat proverb of the week, or like almost always. And today it's one we've seen before. It's Blue Threat Proverb 36. Who you are is where you were when. Who you are is where you were when. And the subtitle is says, we're all a product of our past, for better or for worse, accept it. Well, it doesn't just apply to us. It applies to the moment in time that we find ourselves in and the things that shaped us and forged us into who we are. And that changes our worldview. And when our worldview is changed, it's sometimes really difficult to see and appreciate other people's worldview. And so that's kind of where I want to begin today, is with a discussion of this. So to set the stage, this week actually, but by the time you're seeing that, it'll be last week, I was given a presentation at a large conference. And during that presentation, I used the example of German World War II ace Erich Hartmann. And we're going to bring the slide up on the screen to show you what it was all about. I was talking about vigilance and hypervigilance and situational awareness. And Hartmann was remains an icon in the aviation industry. He is the world's all-time leading ace. As you can see here, 352 confirmed kills. And the way that he did it was very unique, and he was the forerunner of something we now call the OODA loop. OODA loop stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. So anyways, you can bring that slide down now. As I was doing my presentation, I went through it. It seemed to be pretty well received. But after I got off stage, I was sitting down doing my little personal debrief, writing a few notes of things I thought I could do better and some lessons learned. And I got a phone call, actually a text, from one of the organizers of the event and said, can you come down and talk to us? We've had a complaint. And so, yeah, I went down there, and they said we had someone come up to us and say they were very offended that you used an image of a Nazi, right? And I'm not sure whether these exact words came out, but basically, in the current political environment, climate, where fascists and Nazi terms are being thrown around left and right, they thought it was tone deaf. So a couple of ways I could react, right? First of all, I was a little bit shocked, and I thought and said that certainly wasn't my intent. Obviously, I was using this as an example of somebody who developed hypervigilance and became very good at their job by doing it. So I thought a little bit longer, and it came to me that we have to be thoughtful on how we present just about everything these days, because our worldview is not someone else's worldview, right? So looking at, things I might do in the future, am I going to stop using Bubby Hartmann as an example of hypervigilance? I think not, because he's so perfect. But I think the other thing I wanted to do, and specifically on this podcast today, is I want to go to a little bit of the heart of the matter in what we can do in environments like this to avoid misunderstandings. And so I think the first thing is to discuss the complexity and the difficulty we have looking at historical figures as complex individuals. Let's just use Hartman as an example. So who was this guy? Eric Hartman became known as the Blonde Knight of Germany. Right? He was born April 19th, 1922 in Wiesbach, Germany. His mother was a glider pilot way back in the day. Can you imagine that? And his father was a doctor. They were not political. In fact, they lived in China for most of his youth. And only when the China-Japanese tension got really high with the Japanese aggression in Asia, did they decide to move back home, not realizing they were going from the frying pan into the fire, right? Bottom line was they weren't politically active. Their focus was on what most of our focus is, family life, stability, professional success. That was Eric Hartman's growing up story. Because his mom was a glider pilot, he and his brother also learned how to fly as very young men, as teenagers. And they loved it. It was something that a lot of the young men in that area were doing. But by the time he was a teenager, he'd become really an accomplished glider pilot himself. He was now an instructor and teaching other kids how to fly. And so remembering at the time that flying was something that was expensive, but also it was something that was limited by the Treaty of Versailles. Right? Treaty of Versailles was after World War I, the war to end all wars, and it really put tight restrictions on Germany. They couldn't. They had to apply for licenses to build motorized aircraft. Right? So he learned to fly gliders, which is a good way to learn to fly, by the way. So he had been introduced with this. He had a professional passion for flying. He grew up in an apolitical family, right? And then 1942 rolls around, the war starts, and the natural thing for a kid that loves to fly to do is now get a chance to fly motorized airplanes, and some pretty cool ones. And so he joined the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. Right? His love of aviation, his natural skill set, his camaraderie, friends, and family background, he wasn't joining a nationalistic cause. He wanted to just continue to fly. It was the next step. So he went to pilot training, learned how to fly motorized aircraft, and he earned his pilot's wings in 1942. And he was posted to the Eastern Front. Now that's important. Why? Because all the atrocities that the Third Reich were doing was over on the Western Front for the most part. It was where they were filling boxcars up with Jews and other, quote, undesirables, unquote, and moving them to concentration camps, something that wouldn't have gotten to the Eastern Front, which is where they were fighting Russia, right? I think like many Germans of his generation, Hartman grew up in a politically charged environment, but it was propagandized, right? I don't think, in fact, I'm certain he didn't fully grasp the extent of the atrocities that were about to take place, maybe that were ongoing. It was simply about pursuing his passion for aviation in the next way. And quite honestly, when I joined the Air Force, United States Air Force in 1980, that was my goal. I wanted to fly, right? Did I think about someday signing for a bunch of nuclear weapons and theoretically flying missions that could kill millions of people? No. I wanted to fly cool airplanes, right? Now, eventually, did I think about those things? Absolutely. Even in the military, maybe especially in the military, there was a lot of compartmentalization of information, right? There was limited exposure to things like the Holocaust, which wouldn't be named that until afterwards. So by being shielded from the realities of what was going on, he was just out there shooting down airplanes, and deeply embedded in his role as a pilot and primarily focused on survival, right? Not ideology. So that's kind of who he was when he developed all the things that I wanted to train at this event and share with people that were out there. And yet, it still came up that I was tone deaf for using an image of a Nazi pilot in this politically charged environment. So what could I have done differently? I think it's important, and I will do this in the future, to realize that Eric Hartman spoke out vehemently against the Nazi ideology, made it clear that he didn't support the regime's beliefs. He spent 10 years in a Soviet POW camp where they offered him the opportunity to join another authoritative regime, the Russian one, and he refused. Eventually, he got out after 10 years in the Gulag, but during those 10 years, he had a lot of chances to think about history and what it had done. And there's a quote, we'll put this up on the screen too. He said, "One thing I've learned is this: never allow yourself to hate a people because of the actions of a few. Hatred and bigotry destroyed my nation, and millions died. I would hope that most people did not hate Germans because of the Nazis, or Americans because of the slaves. Never hate. It only eats you alive. Keep an open mind and always look for the good in people. You may be surprised at what you find." Right? So had I led with something along those lines, like I am about to use an example that is an appropriate example for what we're talking about, but I want to disconnect it from the ideology of the organization and the system that gentleman found himself in. So what can we learn from all this, right? Quick summary: Hartman's path to the Luftwaffe and the Third Reich was driven by his love of flying, not any ideological commitment to the Nazi cause, right? He got caught up in the war and the society and didn't, at 18 years old, didn't really understand the full extent of what was going on. And I think when you look at everything that he did after the war, right? 10 years in a Soviet camp, went back to work for the German Air Force, exposed corruption in the military-industrial complex, changed the name of the L-104, which was the Starfighter, to the Widowmaker because it was so dangerous. And he just did so many things. For years and years, he continued to have a positive impact on the aviation industry. So I think we need to realize a couple of things. First, people can come from problematic systems without personally supporting the ideology of that system. Happens all the time, right? And if we can separate personal values from actions of a broader regime, we can begin to see and appreciate why they can be used as positive examples. So there's another thing out there. I'm going to call it presentism. 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 And it's a flaw that we have when we evaluate historical figures, not based on the values that were in place at the time, but based on the values that are in place now, right? Think of all of the Confederate war monuments that have been torn down in the United States, or I could go on, but figures like the Founding Fathers here in the United States, or European Enlightenment thinkers, so it's not just a U.S. thing, owned slaves, right? I think we need to understand that at that time, even though these things are still morally problematic, those actions were legal and socially accepted. So to go back and put some sort of cloud around people without understanding that they lived in a different time, right? Who they are is where they were when. So fight the urge to place contemporary values on historical figures and write them off for good or evil based on current norms. That's pretty important. And I think it's important today. This matters today because we've got to be able to use the lessons of history in ways that are historically appropriate, right? Realizing that historical figures were just products of their time. And while their actions wouldn't be acceptable by today's standards, they contributed positively to society in many, many other ways. There have been a lot of guys written off. Eddie Rickenbacker, Curtis LeMay, a bunch of folks that were a generation beyond where Hartman was, but still held feelings that are socially unacceptable today. So enough of presentism and evaluating historical figures with current moral standards. Let's talk more about how we deal with it today. Right? And I'll do it for my example. It would have been very easy for me to say, that was one person in a room of 450. It would have been easy for me to say, oh, that person's too easily offended. But that would have missed the entire point. The point that I didn't understand that there might be people out there that viewed what I was talking about differently than I did, right? So I think this lady's feedback was appropriate. I hope I acknowledged it appropriately and respectfully, and this whole podcast is part of that acknowledgement. I completely get where she's coming from, even though I can't in my head think of anything that would trigger or offend me to that level. That does not mean that other people don't have valid feelings and valid concerns. And in a way, not just in a way, in a very major way, this lady's feedback deepened the message of my presentation. At least it will in the future. It'll illustrate not only the courage to speak up when you see something that bothers you, but some lacking parts of the dialogue, of the context that I was missing, right? So I think there's a few lessons and takeaways from this little event with me. I think the first one is to stay open-minded, whether you're on this end of something that offends you or whether you're the person that has said or done or represented in some way that offends somebody else. I don't think that we can back off of ideas and concepts or what we wear or things like that, but we do need to be cognizant of how this might be impacting other people. So stay open-minded not only to what you see from others, but open-minded on how you are presenting yourself or your message, especially when we're talking about stuff like historical examples. And for those of you that don't know, I'm a historian in my other pair of pajamas. And so it's always easy to lose track of this whole idea of presentism. And so it's better to defang it up front, which I did not do in my example with Eric Hartman. I think the second thing is to value dialogue like this. I think it's fascinating to me. I mean, I've been thinking about it now for a couple of days and put together this podcast outline based on this one courageous woman that came up and said, hey, I was deeply offended by this, right? I think it's great to have open conversations about all topics, especially ones that are emotionally, I don't like the word triggering, but emotionally charged, right? I think the third item here, it's one we've talked about before, is these events, whether it's online or in person like it was with me, they really prompt us to think critically about stuff. It would have been so easy for me to dismiss this as a one-off person out of 500 or 470 or however many people were there. it really helped me to try to build some empathy for people that have different mindsets than I do or than others, right? So it gets past a generalization of, oh, that person's a snowflake or that person's overreacting or whatever it is. And it gets me and can get us out of a defensive mindset to say, hey, pretty good point. Let's see what we can think about. Let's see what we can do about to prevent this, or maybe even leverage it to have a conversation like the one we're having. The fourth thing. So the first three: stay open-minded, value the dialogue, encourage critical thinking. The fourth thing is separate actions from an ideology, right? So it's, right now what we have is a big political divide between, I guess, conservatives and progressives, or Republicans and Democrats, or if you want to get meaner, you'll hear terms like Trumpers and Nazis versus this or that. And all of that is, as we've talked about before, designed to keep us polarized, designed to get us into these emotionally charged states. And it does very little for actual progress or solving problems. So when someone responds or reacts, or when you respond or react, try to realize that human being is probably out there dealing with all the other things we deal with, right? Got to fill up the car. I gotta put food on the table for my family. I'm worried about my career progression. I've got to keep an eye on all these other things, home maintenance, insurance policies. They're living their lives, and yet they're tagged with something that tries to put them into a tribe, right? So somebody's actions may or may not be directed at you appropriately. And I'm not saying that this one wasn't. It probably was. But what I'm saying is you can't, labeling is bad, right? Labeling is bad. We're all complex human beings, just like Eric Hartman was, just like Eddie Rickenbacker was, just like you and I are. We're complex. So separate the actions from somebody and don't turn it into some sort of blanket prejudice or bias. And then here's my historian hat back on. We have to approach historical figures with an understanding of the time they lived in. Who they were was where they were when. And we have to be able to recognize their contributions and their flaws without imposing today's standards wholesale upon them. I think that's only fair. And if we don't do that, we are going to chop off all the lessons from history that we fought so hard to learn from. All right, so I guess I'd like to wrap this relatively short podcast up with one or two thoughts. Fight for feedback, right? If you see something, I don't care if it's over the Thanksgiving dinner table or something else, don't argue. Help me understand why you think that way, right? Look beyond the initial assumption that they're team werewolf or their team vampire or whatever it is. Look beyond that initial assumption. And if you can, most of all, keep the communication doors open. Don't alienate. Don't make an enemy out of a family member or a friend or a professional colleague. Try to understand why they feel the way they do. And then perhaps most importantly, reflect on who you are and what you said or what you did or what reaction you had or that they had that caused this rift. Because only by that kind of dialogue and critical thinking about our own thoughts and behaviors can we ever progress past this hugely polarized world. Keep in mind, there's a lot of industries out there and a lot of families out there that rely on teamwork to survive, right? I'm from aviation, so, I could be sitting in a seat with somebody in the other seat, and we don't see eye to eye on just about anything. But we can stay mission focused, and we can not build barriers and walls between us that are going to prevent us from communicating the important information in a timely manner. So I think the last lesson I'll toss out there at least from my perspective, is we have to understand history in a way that helps us understand ourselves today. We strive to learn from both the successes and moral failures from the past, and we don't shy away from having those discussions. So I guess with that, I was planning on a different topic for today, so I pushed it off till next week. But next week, I want to begin to talk about a series of my favorite books, my favorite mentors, and how I've learned some of the things that I've learned from books. And so we're going to start with Robert Heinlein's book, Stranger in a Strange Land, which is a pretty nice tie-in to this, actually. But lessons we can pull from a lot of different areas. And we're going to begin a short series on that next week. So I hope you'll tune in. In the meantime, please follow, like, share. Sharing's huge. Get this out there to a larger audience. And I'm hoping that you can take a couple of the things we talked about today, put them into practice in your daily life, and become the best version of yourself that you can possibly be with the resources that we have in hand. Thanks, and I will see you again soon.